Good morning and welcome to Health Matters. Thank you. My name is Karen Shishino-Jordan. I'm a local resident here and I am chair of the Stanford Medicine Community Council. It's great to see so many of you here on a Saturday morning. And I'd also like to welcome all of you who are joining us online from around the world. Before we get started, I want to remind you that we'll be accepting questions via the QR code that you can find in your program or on your screen if you're watching virtually. A live Q&A will follow this morning's presentation on how we all can, and perhaps should, be using food as medicine. And for all our attendees, both in person and online, the slides shown during this morning's presentation will be available to view after the event at healthmatters.stanford.edu. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Tamiko Katsumoto, a rheumatologist and clinical associate professor of medicine in the Division of Immunology and Rheumatology at Stanford. Dr. Katsumoto will share with you how certain foods are anti-inflammatory, meaning they help fight inflammation in our bodies. And that's important because inflammation can contribute to all kinds of health problems, including obesity, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and more. Dr. Katsumoto will also share with us how the foods we choose can help protect the health of our planet. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Katsumoto.
All right, am I mic'd? Great. Good morning, everyone. It is just wonderful to see you. Nice honk there. I wanted to send a huge thanks to Carla Scheifele and her amazing team for putting this event together. This is just amazing. Thank you so much. And most of all, I want to thank all of you for being here today. You're being advocates for your own health. I really appreciate the partnership in this effort. And I'm so looking forward to speaking with you today about something that is near and dear to my heart, which is food's protective power against disease, the concept that food really is medicine. Here's my disclosures. I do some consulting for Genentech and Sonoma Bio. I have some research funding from Sanofi. And I want to say we received an unrestricted gift from Beyond Meat, which means unrestricted, they don't have control of what we do. So just going to mention that. Okay. In the next few minutes, what I would like to do is frame this presentation in the context of questions. Let's start out by talking about inflammation and why should we care about this? This hits close to home for me because I'm a rheumatologist and I deal with chronic inflammation all the time. We're then going to talk about what an anti-inflammatory diet is, and then I'm going to try to convince you of why you should think about following this. And finally, very close to my heart, what does diet have to do with planetary health? All right, let's dive in. What's inflammation? Why should we care? So as a rheumatologist, arthritis is the most common condition that walks into my office. Approximately 21% of adults, so like 1 in 5 of us, has some form of arthritis. And according to this graph, you can see there's this increasing prevalence of arthritis over time, now over 63 million people in the US. And this number is expected to increase substantially in the next few years with our aging population. This represents substantial cost, significantly threatens the quality of life for millions of people. So I'm excited to share with you today a recent study that was done by our Dutch colleagues looking at patients with arthritis. This was called the Plants for Joints study. And by joints, I mean the anatomic body joint, not the other kind of joint. This was a randomized controlled trial where they randomized half of the participants to whole food plant-based diets along with lifestyle modifications versus control. And as you can see on the left, the rheumatoid arthritis patients who were in the Plants for Joints group showed a highly significant improvement in their arthritis over the course of the study. And this effect was even more pronounced in the seronegative RA group. These results resonate with me. They're consistent with what I see in my clinic patients when they start to make dietary changes and eat more plants. On the right, we see a study where they looked at osteoarthritis. This is the most common form of arthritis. And it turns out we have very few effective treatments for osteoarthritis. So this result was really quite striking and highly significant. So what this shows us is that plant-based diets can be extremely powerful, and food really can be medicine. We are facing an epidemic of chronic disease in the United States. Currently, 6 out of 10 adults have one chronic disease. 4 out of 10 adults have 2 or more chronic diseases. The most common diseases we know about are cardiovascular disease, diabetes, cancer, Alzheimer's, and there's a very short list of high-risk behaviors. The primary driver of chronic disease used to be tobacco, but guess what? Now, poor nutrition takes the cake, literally, as the leading cause of poor health. So when we look at the standard American diet and the percentage of folks who consume the recommended minimum amounts of fruits and vegetables, you can see it's only 12.3% and 10% of adults that meet these guidelines. When it comes to adolescents, these numbers are in the single-digit range. So we are far from where we should be in terms of our healthful eating. Here's a picture of a lot of familiar foods. Check it out. Pizza, hamburgers, fried foods. These are the things that make up our standard American diet. We're going to call this SAD. Our diets are extremely high in ultra-processed foods, high in animal products, and therefore they are highly inflammatory, and they drive a lot of disease. We have a public health crisis of epic proportions. These are graphs showing the percentage of adults and teenagers who meet criteria for obesity. In 1960, only 13% of adults were obese, and now it's 42%. In the 1960s, only 5% of adolescents were obese, and now it's almost 20%, 1 in 5. So what's more is that now 72% of adults meet criteria for being either obese or overweight. We have a problem. We're most familiar with obesity as being associated with conditions like cardiovascular disease, stroke, diabetes. But what's less well appreciated is the fact that obesity can be highly associated with cancer. This is another condition that I see commonly in my rheumatology oncology clinic. In fact, I deal with a lot of patients that are on immunotherapy. It turns out that the NIH has identified 13 cancers that have been definitively associated with obesity listed here. As you can see, a lot of these cancers are actually related to the gastrointestinal tract. And so we have to wonder about the role of food and our microbiome in driving some of these cancers. Let's take a moment to think about the role that inflammation might be playing in all of this. Acute inflammation is an appropriate adaptive response. We get a cut, we need inflammation to come in to help us heal that wound. We get an infection, we need inflammation to come in and help us clear that infection. What we're talking about, though, is chronic inflammation. There's a number of things that can lead to systemic chronic inflammation. And they're shown here on this very busy slide. I apologize for the people in the back. But probably one of the biggest drivers of chronic inflammation is something we have control over, and that is diet. Importantly, poor diet is linked with dysbiosis, meaning a dysregulated microbiome. We're starting to learn how systemic chronic inflammation can lead to a multitude of diseases, several of which we're going to be hearing from Dr. Wu and Dr. Longo about the heart, about the brain. But also, like we heard, metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, even depression can be inflammatory. And of course, autoimmune disease is highly inflammatory. So what is it in our diets that might be driving this systemic chronic inflammation? This brings us to the topic of ultra-processed foods, which can be highly inflammatory. What are some examples of ultra-processed foods? So here's a diagram that shows examples of minimally processed or whole foods on the left. We've got corn, we've got an apple, we've got cream. These can become processed into canned corn, applesauce, whipped cream. What we should really try to avoid is when the ultra-processed version of these foods, for example, when corn turns into corn chips, when apple turns into apple gummy candies. When cream gets converted into ice cream, right? All of these have additives, and they've been significantly transformed from their original state. They're almost unrecognizable in some cases. A rule of thumb is that if a food has a bunch of different chemicals in it that you wouldn't find normally in your own kitchen, then these may be ultra-processed foods that you should try to limit. We've been hearing headlines about how ultra-processed foods are linked to higher mortality, and we're just starting to unravel the biology of what might make these ultra-processed foods so problematic. So I'm showing you a schematic. I know it's small. On the left, what you can see is this is a normal, healthy, happy gut. There's a diverse microbiome, lots of bugs that live in our gut. They have a very tight epithelial barrier of our epithelium and our gut lining, and there's a nice protective mucus barrier that protects all of us from this stuff. Meanwhile, you add in emulsifiers, artificial sweeteners, food coloring, and nanoparticles like titanium dioxide, which, by the way, we find in Skittles. And this can upset the microbiome and incite inflammation in causing the gut epithelium to be leaky. So the idea is that a leaky gut can allow toxins and bacteria to leak into the body, and this can lead to chronic inflammation that has been associated with poor health. Hence, this highlights the importance of our food choices in maintaining a healthy and robust gut barrier that combats inflammation. All right, so what is an anti-inflammatory diet? Why should we eat this way? You'll be very disappointed to know I'm not here today to tell you what the perfect diet is for you. It turns out that diet is an extremely personalized thing, and there's not a one-size-fits-all approach. That being said, there are several examples of diets that can be more anti-inflammatory. And here, what I'm going to show you are some suggestions from Dr. Andrew Weil, who is the father of integrative medicine. The base of this pyramid is, of course, your healthy vegetables and healthy fruits, which should be consumed generously. Then you've got your whole grains, not refined grains, your beans and legumes, which are a great source of protein and fiber. You've got healthy fats, talking about olive oil, nuts, seeds. Fish and seafood should be consumed in moderation, and I would always suggest looking at the seafoodwatch.org website just to make sure what you're choosing is safe and sustainable. Whole soy foods, such as soybeans and tofu, can be consumed 1 to 2 times a day. Other proteins, such as eggs and cheese and lean meats, can be consumed, but limited maybe to 1 to 2 times a week, according to this pyramid. Healthy herbs and spices can be unlimited, 2 to 4 cups of tea a day and supplements daily. And finally, healthy sweets and red wine should be consumed sparingly. So that's what Dr. Weil has to say. I want to talk about the blue zones. You guys are probably familiar with this. Is a great book and a great series on Netflix by Dan Buettner, where he studied 5 regions of the world with the highest concentration of centenarians, people living to be 100 years old. One thing that he noticed about the diets of people in these 5 blue zones is they were 95 to 100% plant-based. The reason this is so important is that you will never be able to run a diet study for 100 years, right, Christopher Gardner? In fact, most diet studies do not even have that significant of long-term follow-up. So what this means is the Blue Zones diet is a really key dietary pattern that holds a lot of credibility. So let's take a look. When you look at the Blue Zones diet, interestingly, it resembles the Dr. Weil anti-inflammatory diet pyramid in a lot of different ways. Daily, there's a bunch of whole ingredients, whole fruit, whole vegetables, whole grains, beans and legumes, 6 glasses of water, 1 to 2 handfuls of nuts. I just want to point out one theme across all 5 of the Blue Zones is each of those zones had at least 1/2 to 1 cup of beans or legumes every day. And that was a staple for everyone. It's a great protein source. So here are some of the weekly suggestions. So they say fish, maximum 3 times, eggs, less than 3 times a week, and refined sugar, maximum of 7 teaspoons a week. And then, yeah, I know, I like sugar. And finally, meat and dairy products are consumed less than 5 times a month, which means approximately once a week. So there's numerous well-documented benefits of whole food plant-based diets, and I'll just read you some of these here. The highlights are decreases in overall mortality, weight loss, improvements in lipid profiles, decreased risk and even reversal of cardiovascular disease. I'm going to say it again, decreased risk and even reversal of cardiovascular disease. Decreased risk of several cancers, decreased risk of diabetes, even improved migraines. Who knew? Hot off the press, the vegan twin study done by my dear colleague, Christopher Gardner. Spoiler alert for those of you who've not yet seen this amazing Netflix docuseries, but there were even signals that a vegan diet might be associated with slowed aging. So there's numerous other health benefits of whole food plant-based diets. More studies are coming out regularly. I want to take a moment to celebrate fiber. Fiber is one of the best things ever. Note that fiber is only found in plants, not in animal products. And here are some examples of the amount of fiber found in several foods. We should be aiming to eat about 28 to 35 grams of fiber per day or more. So for example, if you ate about 5 of these different foods, you'd be in the right ballpark in terms of fiber. It turns out that currently most of us Americans are deficient in fiber, and we tend to eat an average of 15 grams of fiber or less. In terms of the many benefits of fiber, I cannot sing enough the praises of fiber here, but it can increase your feeling of satiety, so you tend not to overeat. Believe it or not, fiber can actually increase your metabolic rate, and it can promote loss of calories in your stool, such that weight loss is promoted. Who knew? Fiber can help to promote a beneficial gut microbiome, and this leads to the production of short-chain fatty acids that are super important for maintaining your gut barrier integrity and immune homeostasis, so fighting inflammation. Fiber can also improve the glycemic response to food, and it can reduce the risk for heart disease, diabetes, and cancer. Fiber's great. A question I get asked a lot by my patients is, well, how am I going to get enough protein from plants? Here you go. You can see, look at all the beautiful plant-sourced proteins that we have available as compared to the animal-sourced proteins below. So the average individual needs about 0.8 grams per kilogram of protein. So for a 150-pound sedentary person, this is about 54 grams of protein a day, which can be easily achieved by eating a variety of plant foods. Look at all those beautiful plant foods. And in contrast to animal-sourced foods, plants have many beneficial phytonutrients, fiber, and no cholesterol. One issue we struggle with here in the US is overconsumption of refined grains. And by that, I mean white bread, white rice, white pasta. Here are some examples of whole grains we should aim to consume more of, like oats, bulgur, farro, brown rice, millet, etc. It's also worth being familiar with foods like chia seeds, flax seeds, hemp seeds, which are a great source of omega-3 fatty acids, which, by the way, are anti-inflammatory. So let's just say if someone were to be mostly plant-based, I'm going to just say you should supplement with vitamin B12. In addition, all of us, regardless of our dietary patterns, have a high likelihood of being vitamin D deficient, so we should all consider supplementation. There's some nutrients we should be paying attention to if we're primarily plant-based, just to make sure we're consuming enough of them. Iron, zinc, calcium, omega-3s. And a simple way of dealing with this is just take a multivitamin every day. It safeguards against the possibility of deficiencies. I just want to quickly highlight the elegant Fee-Fi-Fo study by Christopher Gardner and Justin Sonnenberg's lab, which showed that fermented foods can be anti-inflammatory. These fermented foods contain a lot of great probiotic bacteria that leads to really good gut microbial diversity, good gut health. I don't have time to go into the details of the study, but again, worth trying to incorporate as many of these fermented foods into your diet as you can. And finally, my patients ask, what about pesticides? Whether should I buy organic or not? And I want to point out a really helpful resource, EWG.org. This stands for the Environmental Working Group. Every year they come out with the Dirty Dozen, 12 foods where it's suggested to buy organic if possible. If you can't, then I would recommend just wash them thoroughly. You can even add a little bit of vinegar or a little baking soda to your water, and that will help remove all the pesticides. And the clean 15 are okay to buy, don't need to buy organic. All right, we can all learn from Michael Pollan's words of wisdom. Eat food, not too much, mostly plants. We're gonna switch gears a bit, and we're gonna try to answer the question, what does diet have to do with planetary health? Newsflash, our planet is not doing well. Here's a graph that shows the sea surface temperatures that have been gradually increasing over the past several years. However, last year, you can see this red line that shows how rising ocean temperatures went off scale. And 2024 has continued this concerning trend. These temperature changes are alarming and unprecedented and are caused by excess greenhouse gas emissions. We have set some disturbing records when it comes to heat and climate change, and this highlights the urgent need for action. So where are all these greenhouse gas emissions coming from? I want to introduce you to a website, Project Drawdown, based on the book by Paul Hawken, drawdown.org. I encourage you to all check out this website, which is a fantastic educational resource on climate change. You can see this is a pie chart of all the global sources of emissions, and what is striking is that food represents about a quarter of our carbon footprint, right up there with electricity. It also turns out that the vast majority of our food emissions are related to animal agriculture. I'm going to show you graphs. This is the per person consumption of meat since the turn of the century, and we're now eating about 200 pounds of meat per year. Here's chicken, 64 pounds of meat per person per year. And here's cheese, 37 pounds per person per year. I don't know about you, but I find the slopes of these curves kind of concerning. Here's our dog. We generally think she's pretty smart, generally makes pretty good decisions. However, this is what happens when we go on walks. It turns out that some foods can be addictive, but that doesn't mean they're good for you, right? So an example is Kentucky Fried Chicken that's been highly processed, deep fried, hyper palatable, but we know it's not a healthy choice. So how much would going plant-based help the environment? Here's a helpful graph showing greenhouse gas footprints of various diets. And what I just want to highlight is that if you were to go vegan 2/3 of the time, not 100%, you would reduce your emissions by 60%. If you went all the way, you would reduce your emissions by 85%. I want to come back to Project Drawdown. They rank ordered the list of high impact climate actions for households and individuals. And guess which two came out on top? Reducing food waste and plant-rich diets. These were higher than solar, LED lighting, recycling, and even electric cars. So I just want to make a quick plug also for reducing food waste and emphasizing the importance of composting to minimize methane emissions from putting food in our landfills. So I get the question about plant-based meats a lot, and here's the relative carbon impacts of various meats versus plant-based meats. And you can appreciate that plant-based meats have a 36-fold less carbon impact compared to regular meat. My patients ask me, well, but these are processed foods. And this is where it's challenging because plant-based meats, they're not soda, they're not candy, they're not Twinkies. It's helpful to refer to the swap meat study by Christopher Gardner, which showed that there were improvements in lipid profiles of people that ate plant-based meats compared to regular meat. And they basically have no cholesterol, they have similar amounts of protein, and they have fiber and other nutrients that regular meat doesn't have. So basically, I wanted to say, if you choose a burger, you feel a hankering for a burger, I would recommend choosing a plant-based burger. So here's a powerful graphic from the World Resources Institute about shifting diets and the profound impact it could have. If the world's 2 billion high consumers cut their meat and dairy consumption by 40%, it would save the land area 2 times the size of India and avoid 168 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions. Here's a graphic showing our current standard American SAD diet, where processed food is 63% of our diet, animal food is 25%. And here is the planetary health diet that looks very much like essentially our anti-inflammatory diets. I want to just quickly shift to the fact that I speak with each of my patients about diet, and too often they tell me, you know what, you're the only doctor that talks to me about diet, which I think is a big problem. And the other good news I want to share is when I talk to my patients, I can personally attest that a lot of them actually come to me and they actually talk about changing their diets. And so this is what inspired the PLANT study. This stands for Providers Learning About Nutrition Together. This was an incredible collaboration, labor of love with my dear friends and colleagues, Dr. Neha Shah and Dr. Miriam Mikowski here at Stanford, where we focused on plant-based nutrition education for our healthcare colleagues. And we hypothesized if we could expose healthcare professionals to a 6-week nutrition education program on whole food plant-based diets, they would be more likely to adopt this dietary style and feel more confident in recommending it to their patients. We designed it as a randomized delayed intervention study. Group A got the early intervention, Group B got the late intervention, and we collected survey data every 3 weeks, and we took our endpoint before the delayed intervention started. We ended up enrolling 102 healthcare providers at Stanford, mostly physicians, a lot of advanced practice providers. They went through the 6-week intervention study, which was lectures, cooking classes, newsletters, and we're excited about the results. It basically showed that there was a significant increase in the likelihood, the readiness to change to a whole food plant-based diet, and level of confidence in terms of discussing whole food plant-based diets with their patients in the early intervention group compared to the late. So based on these results, we are planning to scale this study to reach a broader, more diverse audience, and creating educational resources for both providers as well as patients. So in conclusion, I hope I have convinced you about the merits of eating a more sustainable, anti-inflammatory, whole food, plant-based diet, in that this will reduce our chances of developing a lot of chronic inflammatory diseases, and perhaps just as importantly, it's a diet that's better for our planet. We vote with our forks every single day. Let's vote to improve both our health and the health of our planet. I want to thank my patients most of all, the plant study team, Christopher Gardner and his team, the Plant-Based Diet Initiative, my family, friends, colleagues who've supported me, and of course, all of you for being here today. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Katsumoto, for such an insightful and inspirational talk.
Thank you.
We have a number of questions from all of you. And of course, for those of you here and online, please remember to submit your questions via the QR code. So let's answer some questions. So in your talk, you mentioned that you work with cancer patients. I'm wondering if you can tell us what the optimal diet what is the optimal diet that you recommend for these cancer patients, and does it even make any difference?
Thank you for that question. I think, this is so interesting, right? We talked about a lot of these dietary patterns that showed lower incidence of cancer. So I think it's clear diet can help with prevention of cancer. I think the big question comes up, what if someone has cancer, what do you do? And I'm just going to be honest, a lot of us physicians do not get training on nutrition, and so this is a problem, it's a deficit, right? But too often I've heard people say, oh, just eat whatever you want, you have cancer. And the answer to that is actually not necessarily. I think it's a nuanced answer. If you want to try to really improve your cancer, I think there's ways that food can be medicine in the context of active cancer. And in general, I would say, similarly, the data that shows whole food plant-based diets tend to be preventative in cancer. Similarly, they're probably also helpful for the treatment, right? I think that we actually, one thing that I'm going to tell you about immunotherapy is that there actually is some really exciting data coming out from MD Anderson, where they had a big cohort of melanoma patients, and what they showed was that the patients that had better survival ate high fiber diets. So I thought that was super interesting. So what they're doing right now is a prospective randomized trial where they're randomizing folks to a high fiber versus sort of a normal fiber diet. What they're actually doing is they're asking people to eat close to 50 grams of fiber, like a ton of fiber. So essentially just lots and lots of plants. But I think the data looks very promising for, again, thinking about how this could impact our gut microbiome. And I think we have to think about cancer's not just cancer in itself, it's the immune milieu, it's the gut that's driving a lot of the immune response, right? And I think what immunotherapy has done for the field is it's demonstrated the fact that cancer is not just bad luck, right? We are constantly clearing cancers from our body. Our immune systems are really important for us to fight cancer. A lot of us are probably having little cancer cells that pop up, and our immune system is taking care of them, right? We've learned that when we turn the volume up on the immune system using immunotherapy, it's incredibly effective for some cancers. And so that was a paradigm shift that's happened in the past decade that's been revolutionary. People are living so much longer, right? And so anyway, I want to say that diet can play a huge role. I think there's, every diet, every person is different, every cancer is different. So there's not like a one size fits all, but I will say the healthier, more whole food, plant-based diet is probably a good place to try to aim for in terms of cancer.
Great. Next question. A whole food diet may not be accessible or equitable due to financial strain or living within food swamps or food deserts. Do you have any recommendations, either individually or institutionally, to help remedy this?
So this absolutely breaks my heart. This is a huge problem. I think it's good to hear there's actually now so much acknowledgement of this as a systematic issue we've got. Our whole food system, our whole food culture has turned into a fast food nation. That's what we are. And there are absolutely areas that are food deserts, food swamps, where there's not easy access to whole, healthy food. So I don't have all the answers. I do know it's a huge question that's being addressed. I know there's interest in the NIH. The Rockefeller Institute has actually got a huge thing about food as medicine. There's a lot of things from public health perspective that are being done to really try to address this issue, because I think what I'm excited to watch are all these programs popping up, food pharmacies, right? Mm-hmm. Recognizing the power of food as medicine, and can we prescribe people a pharmacy prescription for food, right? Healthy, whole food. I think that is becoming now a paradigm shift that's going to gain a lot of traction. And so I'm really optimistic that our system is starting to change. It's going to take a lot of, again, willpower. And one thing I want to encourage all of you to do, if you do have the ability, right, to buy organic or to make those choices that, can actually really shift our food system in the right direction, I encourage everyone to. I know there's always equity considerations at play here. I mean, a salad should not be more expensive than a burger, and that's crazy. I mean, I think we can all agree this is a problem, right? I was just recently, we're actually getting into a collaboration with a group in the Central Valley. When I was chatting with a colleague there, and he basically said, I want to do a lot of this food as medicine, healthy whole foods, but I've got a lot of patients that are picking the produce and they can't afford to buy it. And I'm just like, wow, this is just so wrong on so many levels. So it's so clear we really need a collective effort to try to, an advocacy to try to really change the system. So I think there's a lot of good movement in this area. And obviously there's a lot of research interest in trying to push the envelope here.
Right.
So
it also ties in with your point about food waste and keeping the food out of their landfill.
Yes, and that is so huge. I think, this, it's so important just recognizing, try to just buy what you need, simple things like don't overconsume. Bring a doggy bag with you when you go to the restaurant. In fact, bring your own container, right? So you don't need to use a container. I think that's something that one of my friends taught us. And, and that's actually one thing I'm doing also with takeout food, right? The pandemic, there was suddenly all this to-go food that we're ordering, and they were getting more plastic containers. And bring your own container for the food to be put into, right? So we don't have a lot of waste. And then in terms of food waste, really try to buy thoughtfully, don't overbuy. And like I said, try to, leftovers are key. You can freeze things, they will keep. But try to really go for those, tri-bin system, put stuff in the compost, keep the food out of the food waste, or food out of the garbage can, because our methane emissions from food are substantial. I think there was recently a headline that it's more than we realized, right? So we should be very cognizant. And that's like low-hanging fruit. That's easy, right? Just make the choice. Don't throw food away. Compost it. Stick it in the green bin, whatever it takes. We need more tri-bins around. I know they're not everywhere, but we need to aim to have that as a norm. So thanks for bringing that up.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, another question from an audience member. I've tried, but just can't go all plant-based with my meals. Do you have any guidelines for what you'd like people to strive for in balancing meat and plant-based? And which meat and fish do you recommend as being the healthiest?
No, it's a great question. So one thing I'll point out is, I referenced a couple of the food pyramids, actually three. There were three of the different ones. None of them were vegan. I don't know if you noticed that. None of them were like zero meat, animal, whatever. They were it was all about kind of degree of, right? So they all said, it's okay to eat meat. I think Blue Zones was like maybe once a month or once a week or so, right? And Eat Lancet Commission, similar, right? So I think the answer to that is understand, right? Like meat is such an important part of a lot of our cultures, right? It's something that, but I think what's happened as when I showed you those USDA graphs where you can see the meat consumption just climbing, right? I mean, we didn't always eat this way, right? I mean, meat used to be a treat. It was not the main attraction. And so I think there's certain, strategies, I'm gonna reference Christopher Gardner, right? The protein swap, where meat becomes more of a condiment, not the main attraction, right? Really kind of crowding stuff out by adding more plants to your plate, adding more whole grains, things like that. So I think there's strategies like that. In terms of the question about which meats, which fish, again, I would say go for the lean meats. I would say, chicken is less environmentally impactful than red meats, ruminant meat. And I would say, the leaner the better. Fried chicken, Kentucky Fried Chicken, not a great choice. But also from a fish perspective, I think we need to be cognizant of what's happening in our oceans. I think that we're all nervous. We know that there's been overfishing. We know that there's ocean pollution. I don't want to be a Debbie Downer, but I want to let's talk the reality of we're talking about, we have to think about sustainability of the ocean. We don't want to consume way too much fish because we have to worry about mercury. We have to worry about other sort of pollutants and things. So I think the best guidance there is, check out seafoodwatch.org. I think it's a really helpful website. Another one that I think is super helpful is NOAA, the National Oceanic Atmospheric something. There's the administration. So NOAA is another one that has a really nice guidance about seafood. So I would say those are sort of some of the tips and tricks that I use with my patients.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, the next question. I'm hearing so much conflicting information about protein. I know it varies according to person, but how much does the average person need?
So we knew this was going to come up, right? Protein, protein, protein. So, I'll be honest with you. I think that protein is overhyped. I think that there's so much focus on we need so much protein. I mean, one thing I'll just point out is if you remember that slide, very busy slide that had a lot of the different plant proteins, we are probably getting way, way, way more protein than we really need. You can't store protein, so it basically just turns into fat if you eat too much. Way too much protein does strain your kidneys, though it's not good. There are differences in protein needs based on your physiology, based on if you're sedentary, if you're active. I've heard about those weightlifters trying to bulk up, or if you're pregnant, you need a little bit more. If you're older, in the whole issue with what's called sarcopenia, where you tend to get more muscle wasting when you get older. So there may be some differential protein requirements based on kind of your physiology. But that being said, it's not that far off, right? I mean, I think that, and then the other thing I'll point out is plant-based proteins are intrinsically probably better in terms of the fact that you can also get the phytonutrients, right? You get the antioxidants, better for your vascular function because you don't get a bunch of cholesterol. That's one thing that I always think about when you've got these athletes that are bulking up and eating a lot of red meat and chicken, and it's but you need quality vascular function to optimize your performance. And so actually, right, there's great plant-based protein powders like Orgain. I don't work for Orgain, but different examples where there are actually good plant protein sources to think about. And then I'll just, again, saying from a plant-based meat perspective, they are actually pretty on par in terms of the amount of protein contained in the plant-based meats. So keeping that in mind, I think, is important as well if you really want to get some protein. So I think again, I know it's a hot topic. There's 1,000 different, talks, podcasts and things that debate protein. I'm going to actually put a shout out to Christopher Gardner, who I think gives one of the best talks on protein. So check out his stuff. He's got a lot of great podcasts on protein. So anyways, I think we'll keep it at that, if that sounds good.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned sarcopenia because at my age, I need more protein. But what about a special case like pregnancy?
Yeah, pregnancy, I think, again, so 0.8 grams per kilo is what sort of the average amount that's recommended. That's the RDA. For pregnancy, it may be closer to 1.2. but it's not double, right? It's not like a massive change. And again, everyone is so different, right? So I think you do have to be cautious when you are pregnant. You do need to, I recommend if you are plant-based, it's worth working with a dietitian, just making sure you're hitting all the guidances in terms of how much of the different nutrients, the different protein, macronutrients and micronutrients. I think that's a fair thing to do. But it's absolutely safe to be vegan if you're pregnant. Again, just to be doing it thoughtfully is the key.
Great. Another interesting question. Are there differences between soy, almond, and oat milk? Is there an ideal milk?
Such a great question. I actually tend to drink soy and oat personally. I tend to avoid almonds because I think about the environmental impact and the fact that almonds require so much water. Mm-hmm. We live in California. I think many of you remember we've been through some droughts, right? And I think it's important to just recognize that almonds are a huge source of, they require a lot of water. So I tend to avoid that. Soy and oat are both great. I will say soy is probably, higher in protein. For people that may have issues with glucose intolerance, I think it's worth thinking maybe soy might be a little bit better tolerated because it has a little bit more protein. Oat milk may tend to spike people's sugar a little bit more. I think it's also important point here to bring up, which is that the order of your food matters, right? The order of how you eat food. If you are eating things like fiber and protein first, and then you have your carbs after that, that will help kind of diminish the glycemic spike that you could get. Other things that are tips and tricks are that actually exercise makes a big difference. I have patients that have their continuous glucose monitors, these CGMs they wear on their arms. They're super cool. Sometimes it's almost too much data, but one of my patients, she was so awesome. She's like, all right, I'm gonna eat this. And she ate a sweet potato and then she basically saw her sugar spike and she's, oh no. And she did this total N of 1 experiment where she was like, okay, now I'm gonna try to eat protein ahead of that. And she did, and it kind of made the curve lower. And then she's like, all right, now I'm gonna exercise before and after. And it totally helped smooth out that curve. So, again, all of these things matter and everyone's body is different. And I have to say, it's pretty cool. This is really personalized nutrition when you've got CGMs that are monitoring your blood glucose. I think it's really interesting. We can really understand how does our body react, right? Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot of hacks like that in terms of how to eat in a way that will be, again, good for people that are more insulin, that have more insulin resistance or may be prone to hyperglycemia.
That post-dinner stroll makes a big difference.
Post-dinner stroll is absolutely key. Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
Okay, we're shifting a little bit. There's so much discussion about sugar consumption. What do you think about a diet heavy in fruit? This person from the audience said they eat 3 to 4 cups of fruit a day, and they hear that this could potentially be problematic.
So I think it's a really good question. And yes, fruit does have sugar, which is fructose, for example. The thing about it, and the thing to keep in mind, is that whole fruit is so different than fruit juice. When you eat whole fruit, you're getting the fiber, you're getting all these structures. So when you put that in your body, it's actually changing, right? You don't get the massive sugar spike. Well, some people may get some sugar spike, but again, just think about the ordering of your foods. I actually learned that if you do a smoothie, that may also change things up, so you get more of a sugar spike. But generally speaking, whole fruit can be such a good thing for you because it has the matrix of fiber and other things that are the whole fruit. So I would say this, I wouldn't say go fruitarian, meaning all fruit diet, but I would say, again, fruit is one of the good things. I have that in my good list, right? So we want to encourage that. Yeah.
Okay. What about snacks? Are snacks like popcorn good for you? And what about also protein bars and chickpea snacks? Are those considered ultra-processed?
So here's where we get into the nuances. So popcorn, I think, and again, I'll tell you this, the whole processed food field is just very confusing. There's 8 different systems of naming processed foods, right? And I think there's a lot of discordance, disagreement, nuance, and kind of like I made the reference to, right? Like plant-based meat is not a Twinkie. Like we're not talking about the same thing. And yet, based on some systems, they both get classified as ultra-processed. So I don't think it's fair to lump everything in that one bucket. I think there's still more work to be done to try to parse out nuances about processing and about the nutritional content of stuff, right? Like it's really, what is it? Like if it's crap versus if it's like protein and fiber, things like that is super different. So I think that I would say this popcorn, without all the butter, and try to avoid PFAS on the lining of the microwave popcorn, try to avoid that. Protein bars, yeah, they're ultra processed. Yeah, there's probably a lot of sugar in them. Again, I'm not here. It depends on instead of what, instead of what are you eating, right? Because probably the protein bar is better than a candy bar. What was the other thing? Chickpeas, yeah. So there's a lot of things like that where it's not like an all or none. And I'll be honest with you, I mean, yes, processed foods are fast and they're easy and they're cheap. And so we just have to be mindful of what type of processed food they are. And ideally, we don't want, like I showed you, we don't want 63% of our diet being processed foods. Not a good thing. So
probably a good rule of thumb is also to look at your protein bars, and if there are ingredients, again, that you don't recognize, probably choose a different protein bar.
Exactly. That's right. That's right. The fewer ingredients, the better. More whole food, the better. 100%. Yes.
Oh, a question on celiac disease. So this audience member tested negative for celiac disease, but they still feel lousy when they eat any type of bread products. Any suggestions for dealing with that in the diet?
So this is a great topic, and it's actually a bit controversial. I would say the science is not quite there yet, but I will tell you personally, I have had a lot of patients that tell me they have gluten sensitivity, and I believe them. Absolutely believe them. I think that celiac disease, so just to kind of make sure everyone's on the same page, celiac disease is really a true kind of autoimmune reaction where we have T cells that respond to the gluten protein in wheat. Okay, so literally you can test people and you look and there's an antibody, it's called tissue transglutaminase antibody. And in fact, a lot of our autoimmune disease patients have celiac disease. And so you can find, you scope them and you can see changes in their gut epithelium that are consistent with celiac disease. It's a problem, increasing in prevalence. But then there's people who don't meet criteria for celiac disease, but they swear when they have bread products, they do get reactions. They may get bloating or they may get arthritis. I've had patients get joint swelling. And so it's super tricky. And I want to say one thing about my profession, which I think is super interesting. People don't feel their cholesterol going up. People don't feel their hemoglobin A1C or glucose going up. People feel their joints, right? People feel pain. And I swear to God, I have patients who come to me and they say, doctor, I eat this or that or this, and my joints flare. And it's absolutely fascinating. Like, what an incredible N of 1 experiment where we can sort of start to identify food sensitivities based on symptoms. So these things are very real. Like I said, I talk to patients about diet all the time, and we kind of explore these things. So one thing I want to just bring up that, again, it's hard to do a big randomized controlled trial, right? Because not everyone is the same. But what I do with my patients is I do N of 1 trials. I basically take my patient, I say, okay, let's go through. Let's see if you can identify certain triggers, right? And gluten is one that I hear about a lot. I also hear about sugar. When I overdose on sugar, I totally flare my arthritis. That's a common one. Sometimes it's dairy. Sometimes dairy will flare arthritis. And again, it can be different for different people. I've had people say, oh my God, red meat flares my arthritis. And it's like, you know what? It is what it is for these people. I completely hear them. So the gluten question, I will say this, I think the science is starting to evolve. I think we need to understand food intolerance and how the biology plays out. But I think the answer to that is what I've heard possibly is related to the fact that we do have genetically modified wheat in our country here. So it's genetically modified. I think there's even higher sort of content levels of gluten and other proteins. They're bred to be resistant to a lot of the pesticides we use. So glyphosate is one that you've probably heard about. And I have heard that when we harvest the wheat, they spray the wheat down with a bunch of glyphosate. And guess what? We're probably consuming a lot of that. So who knows what we're reacting to, but I think we need to be cognizant of our food quality and kind of how this is impacting us. And I'm super interested in understanding the interplay, right, of our environment and how that impacts our food, how we grow our food. And we just have to, again, think about a kinder, gentler way to change our agriculture system, our food, production system, our sales and distribution system, so that it really fosters a culture of health and well-being for both all of us individually and for our planet. I think these things are all in alignment, and I think that we have a vision that, again, is achievable. We just have to all work together. So, and I don't know if I have a minute to say this, but I want to plug out. Oh, I don't. Okay. So we have, I want to say there's a really great collaboration with the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability that's happening, where we're bringing together the ocean scientists, the food science folks, the engineers, all these folks. We're all coming together to really try to create a more sustainable food system. So stay tuned. I think there's a lot of action in that space that I think is going to be super important.
Well, I appreciate the fact that you are having these conversations with your patients, and it, I think, highlights the importance of the study that you told us about.
Yeah.
And hopefully it empowers everyone here and listening to be your own advocates and to encourage having these conversations with your caregivers. But I just want to thank you again for... And also, thank you for kind of helping us understand how diet affects inflammation, which affects our health, and how that all kind of goes into the health of the planet. We do have, I wanted to remind you, the pavilion, where you can get questions answered from our nutrition experts. There's a live cooking demo. And to please come back at 11 o'clock, we have a talk from Dr. Longo about brain resiliency. So I hope to see you all back here in a few minutes, and thank you again.